Okay, good evening everybody, and thanks for coming along. We're here to present this evening the outturn of a collaborative bit of research that was done between Arup and Emer. And as you can see from the title of the project, or the projects involved, it is based on resilient infrastructure. And the resilience of our infrastructure in Emer has been something that has been particularly challenged, not only from the recent winter storm period, but cumulatively over a number of years, where we've been seeing increasing impacts on our infrastructure from storms in terms of the sustained nature of them and in terms of their overall impacts. So the project devised as a collaboration between Arup and Emer was to develop tools for the assessment of infrastructure performance around the areas specifically of coastal erosion and flooding. And as I say, the impacts on the infrastructure can be quite substantial, and no more so demonstrated than the last winter period. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So just in general, the context of the presentation is very straightforward. I'm just going to give a little bit of a background to the project and an introduction to the context in terms of Emer and the infrastructure involved. And then I'm going to hand you over to Emer and to Susanna, who will talk in more detail about the specific two pieces of research done, which was around the development of tools for supporting decision making around coastal erosion and around flooding, and the development of those tools in terms of strategic decision making and ultimately in things like investment and prioritization and how they can help in that. The presentations will also then afford time for conclusions and discussion afterwards. So generally, a bit of background to the project. The project was developed and evolved from an Arup-funded, internal funded mechanism, and was carried out in calibration with Emer. And specifically, the aims of the project were, we took two areas of research around coastal erosion and flooding. As I say, the objectives were to develop tools to help in assessment of vulnerable areas on the network with respect to coastal erosion and flooding, and to help us support our own decision making in terms of those. The extent of the study picked a representative area from between Bray and Greystones, an area that is significantly prone to the impacts of both coastal erosion and flooding itself, as we've seen over the last number of years. But the objective of the scope of the project was that we could use this as a test area with the aim of actually applying the tools that we develop over other areas of the rail network. So a brief context to the project itself from an Irish Rail perspective and as the infrastructure manager. When we started doing the scope of the projects in detail, and developing it, we quickly came to the conclusion of the value in terms of coastal erosion and flooding as areas of research worthy of development of support tools. And that was early in 2015, where we defined the detailed scope. We then had the winter of 2015 and into the new year of 2016, where there was significant impacts, not just on the railway infrastructure, of course, but it's not so long ago, only a few weeks ago now, and we remember the impacts of on infrastructure throughout the country. And as I said, the Irish Rail, we were significantly impacted by that as well. So I'm just going to illustrate that by graphs of the damage caused by caused on our infrastructure, and how that lended itself to the development of the tools that the research projects that we undertook were developed. So the first picture there is a picture of Enniscorthy town, and if you weren't too familiar with it, you might not recognize it. And as you can see there, right through the picture, you can see the bridge over the River Slaney, the railway bridge over the River Slaney into the train station there, except for that all that you can see of the bridge really is the parapet poking out above the water. Now that bridge is a fairly unique bridge. It's a timber way-beam structure, one of only about 5 of that type of bridge on the network. And as you can see, the extent of the is very, very significant, and the flood levels there resulted in line closure of that asset. And one of the important aspects of that is illustrated by this photograph is, and which follows through into the research projects, is knowledge of assets. The bridge here resulted in a line closure. I think it was around the 29th of December, yet we had the line reopened around the 3rd or 4th of January, so it was closed for the best part of a week, but no longer. In terms of the safety and the integrity of the bridge and the post-flood event investigations into the bridge, it was some weeks before the flood levels had receded enough such that we could get divers in to inspect the bridge and to inspect the foundations. However, progressively over the last number of years, we've been investing in things like asset knowledge and knowledge of bridge foundations and things like that. We have a very aged bridge base, a lot of bridges of significant ages where we don't necessarily have the detailed knowledge of things like what the bridge is founded on, and so we've been progressively gathering this knowledge over our asset base. And the value of that type of information really comes to the fore when you're faced with difficult decisions like whether to open a bridge or whether not to open the bridge, especially when you're in a situation where you can't get in and inspect the foundations of the bridge, which, as I say, we couldn't do for some time, for some weeks after the flood event. So we managed to open this bridge within a few days, despite the existing flood levels still being very high, because of confidence in the asset knowledge that we had. And that's an important point, not only from an operational point in terms of getting services operating quickly after flood events as soon as possible, but also from the point of view of the development of such support tools as we're talking about today, and in terms of founding those on proper making proper decision making based on proper and sound asset knowledge. Basically, if you want to have a decision support tool that's going to support your decision making, it has to be founded on proper knowledge of your assets and detailed knowledge of your assets. So that was particularly important around this asset, not only from an operational point of view, but also from the benefit that can be accrued in terms of development of decision support tools. There's another picture of Enniscorthy, again showing the extents of the flood levels, and you can see beyond it the further extents where the water levels are not far from the top of the platform level. So again, it highlights the severe extent of the flood and the flood events over the winter and Christmas and New Year period recently gone by. Another feature of the flood events was not just the sustained nature of them, and it was very sustained and relentless over a number of weeks period, but also the types of flooding that we were exposed to, and that ranged from fluvial, pluvial, but also coastal erosion. We seem to get all impacts throughout the network at various locations, throughout the network and of various types. The photograph here illustrates a section of coastline and the adjacent railway at the Murrow in County Wicklow. And one of the features you can see of the photograph there is at the top of the photograph there you can see the end of the extent of some existing rock armour that had been placed for coastal protection, obviously, and then the eating away of the beach thereafter. One of the things that was very evident from the period just gone by, the winter period, was the rate of erosion was absolutely huge. And we've noticed that over years that it seems to be continually getting increasing at an accelerated rate. In fact, in some coastal areas along the east coast, we've lost up to 32 metres over a 4-year period. So it really is a major issue for us, and more so exacerbated than the winter period. So another example there of the flooding impacts, and this was very typical of the railway network over the Christmas period and into the New Year. In fact, you will remember from the news and other sources that that's a typical photo of Ireland in general over that period. The flood impact was absolutely massive, and as I say, the types of flooding and the types of impacts were quite varied. And one of the most is very sustained in their nature, and significant impacts. So whilst the scope of the projects and the research were developed, we decided very early on that they were relevant and good topics to invest in terms of this research. I think that decision was further compounded by the winter period just gone by, and really demonstrates that coastal erosion and flooding are huge and hugely impacting issues for us, and demonstrates the value in the collaborative research that we've undertaken with Arup. And hopefully now we can demonstrate the value of the research itself. And Emer and Susanna are going to take us through the two specific projects of flooding and coastal erosion. Just before I hand over to Emer, I do want to express thanks to Arup in terms of the development of this collaborative research. We're very passionate in Ireland about our infrastructure, and I was delighted when we started the collaboration that Arups were equally as passionate as ourselves about our infrastructure, and it really led to very good value and very good derived value in terms of the product that we got at the end of the research, which is 2 very useful tools in terms of strategic decision support around coastal erosion and flooding. So thanks to Emer, Suzanne and Gavin O'Donnell in Arup, and to Dave Gannon in Ireland as well. So I'm going to hand you over to Emer now, who's going to talk about the tools in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Cathal. Okay. Good evening. My name is Emer Kennedy. I'm a senior water engineer in the Arup water team. My role in this was to oversee the research into the interface between external flooding and the rail corridor. So for this project, we looked at 2 aspects: flooding from the external catchments and also flooding on the rail corridor from rainfall events. As Cathal mentioned, we chose the study area of Braehead to Greystones. In choosing this study area, we got together with the coastal research team and Irish Rail and wanted to really figure out what study area we could apply the same study as the coastal research team, so we could compare results at the end. But also for specific to flooding, we wanted a research area that would be representative of the majority of the Irish Rail network throughout the country. So in particular with this catchment, it had mountainous areas around Braehead, then it goes into lowland agricultural area before ending in the urban area of Greystones. So as I mentioned, we looked at the pluvial and fluvial sources of flooding and how they interact with the rail corridor. So the aim of this project is it's a high-level assessment to come up with a tool to rapidly assess large sections of the rail corridor, and from this be able to prioritise where further investigation or research is needed. In broad terms, the research steps were the desktop study, which I'll get into in more detail shortly. The desktop study, which informed our targeted site visit. Following this, we did a hydrological and hydraulic assessment. From here, we analysed our outputs and presented the outputs in a colour-coded risk matrix format. We compared this with the research conducted by the coastal research team. So I'll just go into each of these categories in a bit more detail now. So the desktop study. First of all, we reviewed publicly available information. This is information such as the Office of Public Works Catchment Flood Risk and Assessment and Management Study. These are publicly available online. We also looked at historical information from the OPW Flood Maps website. We then looked at the meta and rainfall data for both Braehead and Greystones Beach. Even though it's such a small catchment, we just needed to get a feel for the difference in rainfall patterns between the mountainous Braehead region and then the low-lying Greystones area. We'd also received quite a large body of data from Irish Rail. This included culvert inspection records, topographical survey and survey of the existing utilities within the rail corridor. We also then looked at the OSI mapping data, which you can see on screen here. From this, we're able to quickly map the external catchments and determine where we would assume there would be a point inflow into the rail corridor. We then compared this with the Irish Rail inspection records and culvert data to see if it correlated with culverts on the ground. More often not it did, but we did find a couple of instances where we needed further investigation. So these were high priorities in our site visit. We also looked at for that, and that was one of the main inputs into the target site visit was to look at the potential flow mechanisms. So as part of that, we had a look over the topographical survey provided by Irish Rail, identified low points in the rail corridor, and identified these as potential sources of ponding on the rail corridor. We then mapped all of this data, as you can see here on the left, and this data was what we used for going to site. With this method, we're able to cover quite a large section of the rail corridor in quite a brief amount of time. I think it took about 2 hours to review the 6 kilometres of the study area. So just a screen grab of some of the survey. The Irish Rail actually maintained quite an extensive amount of topographical survey, and this covers approximately 50 kilometre width of rail corridor. I'll go into this in a bit more detail shortly, but this was a key input into our pluvial analysis of rainfall runoff in the rail corridor itself. So, first of all, for the assessments, the hydrological assessment of the external catchments. As I mentioned earlier, we looked at the OSI mapping to look at the topography of the external catchments and determine where those point inflows were. We then came up with our assessment criteria by a desktop review of the comparable studies and came up with our criteria of a 1 in 10 year ARI event and a 1 in 30 year ARI event, and then finally a 1 in 100 year being a more critical storm event. We estimated the runoff from the external catchments based on 3 methods depending on catchment size. This is using the Agricultural Advisory Service for catchments less than 0.4 kilometres squared, right up to the FSU web portal for catchments greater than 25 kilometres squared. So from this, we worked out, we had a look at the culverts that we had data on to assess their performance. Again, this is a high-level assessment of the culvert performance based on the Syria guidance. The criteria for pass in this instance was the headwater level upstream of the culvert. If it was above the soffit level of the culvert, it warranted further investigation. At this point, we compared the headwater level with the top of rail level. Sorry, I just mentioned on that. We also compared this with the results of the flood flow analysis, which was our assessment of the rainfall profile over the rail corridor. In some cases, this indicated where there could be ponding along the track, but it also showed where there would be ponding adjacent to the track. For this study area, that might be that is generally on the land side of the rail corridor. Again, this generally did correspond where we had identified the point inflows. So this is a typical output of that assessment of the culverts, just giving you an image of the headwater level relative to the soffit or the rail level. Now the rail corridor, as I said, there were 2 aspects: external drainage, which was based on the OSI mapping and looking at the point inflows and sheet inflows. The other aspect is looking at the rainfall, the impacts of rainfalls directly onto the rail corridor itself. So for this, we prepared storm intensity data. We received storm intensity data from Met Éireann and prepared our IFD curves. We also considered climate change and factored it up by 20%. We then used the flood flow, which is a suite of the microdrainage WinDes software, where you can apply synthetic rainfall over a topographical area and assess how that rainfall behaves, where it ponds, and at what frequency it ponds and severity. One aspect of this was we had to determine the critical duration of the storm. We decided to choose a baseline critical duration to make the studies relatively quickly comparable, and that if you have an impact in one area, it could be quickly compared to another area, so the prioritization could be applied. In general, we found that some of the internal rail corridor catchments were quite long, so because of this, we decided a 1 hour duration would be appropriate for a baseline study. So this is just a screen grab here on the left. This is a screen grab of a typical flood flow assessment, a flood flow analysis output. So we colour-coded the depth bands. The red band being a low impact or 100 mil of ponding, yellow is 300 mil, and white, which isn't shown here, but white is 600 mil. The low impact ponding of 100 mil doesn't necessarily translate to visually 100 mil of ponding above rail level. This is more indicative of it's where the water will filter through the ballast and sit on the subformation. It's low impact because it's not going to cause rail stoppage, but it is an impact because if it's on a higher frequency event over a longer course of time, this can cause damage to the subformation or cause an ingress of fines into the ballast. The higher impact then on the other end is a 600 mil depth. We looked at the void ratio and the typical depth of ballast in the Irish rail network, and took this to be, this translates that in that regard when you consider the voids. This translates to about 100 mil above top of rail, and this is enough to trigger a rail stoppage. So this would be seen as quite a severe impact. So from all of this, the risk ranking is quite intuitive, that if it's a more frequent event with a higher depth of ponding, it will be considered a very high priority. Then if it's a less frequent event with not as much ponding, it's a lower priority. In terms of how the culverts interact with this, as I said, we generally found where the landside ponding adjacent to the rail corridor from the flood flow analysis, where that happened, it generally coincided with the culvert. And we would look at that culvert and that ponding location and determine, is the culvert performing? If the culvert wasn't performing on our high level assessment, then we would definitely trigger further investigation. There are also a couple of instances from our site walkover, one instance on our site walkover where we couldn't immediately find the culvert, so that would automatically trigger it to be a high priority assessment because we couldn't carry out a proper assessment of it. But needless to say, that further investigation could indicate that the culvert is in place. So I'm just going to go through some of the risks that Cathal had went through these as well earlier, but in more specific to the impacts of ponding. So as I've said, that the severe impacts will be rail stoppage. The lesser impacts could be like the longer term damage such as ballast fouling. So this is an example on the Kiltartan at Kiltartan on the Limerick to Galway line. This actually is caused by culvert collapse, but also there was a lot of ingress of water into the ballast and failure of the subformation. So this was quite a severe event. So this is basically ballast washout. This is a sinkhole. This could be caused by, this is a sinkhole on the Limerick to Waterford line. This could be caused by that low level of impact over a longer duration, ultimately causing the subformation to fail, and this would have quite a severe impact. This is a landslip on the Kerry line at Clean. This would be sheet flow, most likely sheet flow into the catchment, running down the face of the cutting. Without drainage along the top of this cut, it's resulting in landslides onto the track. So this is just a screen grab of our output, how we, once we'd completed the analysis and looked at the external catchments as well as the internal rail corridor, we just presented the information graphically, so it'd be quite easy to understand. So red is high priority, yellow medium priority, and green was not mapped as it would be considered low priority at this point. So a typical output then, I'll just to zoom in on one in particular. This particular location, the flood flow analysis indicated that there was quite a lot of ponding, a 600 mil ponding in a 10-year of ARI event. But you'll note that this is actually trackside ponding, so it's not on track, so it would not cause rail stoppage. However, we did flag this as a red point as there was an unknown asset. So this is the one I mentioned earlier where we weren't quite sure, but is quite heavily vegetated. So the recommendation here is to do a more detailed survey of that particular area. The potential issues here would include washout of track formation, as we saw on a previous slide, and ingress of fines into the ballast. So this, the study, as I said earlier on, the objective of this study was to provide a methodology, just a way forward for the end user to just quickly assess a large body of information and come up with a strategy for prioritising where to focus energy and further studies. So the first step is, the steps are highlighted in green. These are steps we've just described. So the steps are highlighted in green, followed by the input data required to achieve that outcome in blue, and the actual output then is in orange. So the first, as we spoke about, the first step is to select your subject site. In this case, it was Braehead to Greystones. Identify the potential flood mechanisms. This is by the desktop study, but also local knowledge of the area. Then identifying the external catchments just based on desktop mapping data, and then have a look at the topographical survey. This all, once we mapped and compiled and mapped this data, it informed a targeted site visit. And from here, we were able to either confirm the Irish Rail asset or identify if there was an information gap. Following this, we carried out a hydrological assessment of both the external catchment and the internal rail corridor. The external catchment, as I said, was looking at the different methods of estimating your Q10 to Q100 flow rates. And in the internal area, it was looking at the intensity, frequency, duration curves and applying a factor of climate change. The hydraulic assessment then, just for the culverts or bridges, it would be just using Syria guidance, giving consideration to your upstream and downstream boundaries such as tidal influences. the rail corridor drainage, as I've described, we use a flood flow suite from microdrainage. Finally, from all of this, we compiled a risk assessment and our graphical outputs. So the conclusions from the study were that we were able to identify areas where more research or more studies would be required as a higher priority. We found that an asset register recording information that would be very specific to a drainage engineer or someone looking at the flooding impacts. This is just a quick sample on the bottom. The Airnode Air GIS database proved to be a very useful source of data. They do have a huge wealth of information in-house. However, we found that there could be some changes to this to make it slightly more user-friendly or easier for contain more relevant data specific to that culvert. We'd also recommend that this will be applied on future assessments based on the methodology flowchart presented earlier. I'll hand you over to Susanna now to go through the coastal research. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Susana Lizondo. I'm a senior maritime engineer working with Arup in the maritime group. I'm going to describe the coastal research that we did in collaboration with Irish Rail. Well, first of all, just to give you some little bit of background, we all know that we have been facing in recent years big storms which have caused important damages in our coastline in Ireland. So we know that some of the Irish railway lines are situated in these areas, and well, we are looking at an example here in the image where we can see this retreat that Cathal was also mentioning. This only happened overnight, so we can see that the coastal challenges are quite important. So at the same time, we have the need to assess more environmentally friendly solutions for these kind of coastal problems, and we should aim to promote other kind of solutions. We can see there in the image the big damage which happened, and we can see the progression. So you can see the importance of that sudden slide which happened in just a very short period of time. In this case, the failure just happened beside an existing revetment, which is a typical situation which usually happens in coastal engineering, where the adjoining area is very soft, and then at the end of your revetment, you have a point of failure. Well, the methodology that we followed for this study consisted on different stages. First of all, we collected all the existing data, around all the areas that Irish Rail provided us with. So then the first thing was doing a workshop with Irish Rail and with our experts, railway experts and geotechnical experts and flooding experts. And then we were trying to define which would be the best area so that we could focus the study on. We decided that the area, as Emer was mentioning before, would be from Warehead to Greystones, South Beach. So after that, we did a couple of site visits with our geotechnical experts and then the maritime experts. We assessed all the information compiled in both site visits, previous studies, and our own research, and then we came with the assessment. As Emer was just mentioning before, our area extends from Braehead to Greystones, South Beach. The reasons from the coastal point of view to select that area would be that this area is plenty of coastal assets which need to be protected. Also that Arup had extensive knowledge of this area because we have done so many projects before in the past. So then we proceeded with the study. For the study, we divided the area into the 3 different areas, attending to their coastal features. So the first area would be Braehead, which is a rocky headline. This area had many troubles in the past, big important geotechnical failures. So as you can see there in the image, for example, that's a redundant tunnel, which is not used anymore. This area has a number of coastal assets to protect that, and it was just upgraded in 2002, where a number of revetments were upgraded. Next area will be Greystones, North Beach. We can see in that image one line showing the predicted retreat for the year 2050. This line and this image, it comes from the iris protection strategy. So we can see that for that year, the railway line, which is actually located quite far from the coastline, will be affected. Now, it's important to mention that this study didn't take into consideration climate change. So as we can see, this could be a real risk for even the short term. So the line will be affected. We can see there in these images some natural retreat in the area and some localized slides. Then Greystone South Beach. In this area, the challenge is that the railway line is really close to the seaside. So then it's subject to both overtopping and coastal damages. So this part of the railway line was already relocated in 1912, and right now it's facing some overtopping, as I just said. The iris protection strategy also indicates some predicted coastal retreat in this particular area. Then we were talking about climate change, so in this image I'm just trying to summarize the key effects and how exactly climate change is likely to affect our coastal areas. So if you look at the image just coming from the sea, you can see that sea level rise is likely to bring some increase of the storminess. That means that we are likely to have higher wave heights and also more frequent. So that increased wave action is likely to cause a further erosion of the coastline, and also that the levels of the beach and seabed go lower, which also will accelerate the wave action. So all of that will lead to an increased coastal erosion, which is a risk for the railway line. Now, coming from the land side, we can see that climate change is likely to bring more erratic and more frequent rainfall, which of course will lead to an increased weathering and more likely to happen slides. So as you can see then, the risk to railway line will be affected from both sides, land side and seaside. We can see a similar situation for the Greystone North Beach, which will be our next area. In this case, the difference will be that the cliffs are much softer in this case because they are made of clay and sands, but the situation is very similar. So we can see there the risk coming from the seaside and also the land side. Finally, for Greystone South Beach, the situation again is very similar, but in this case, the climate change will bring direct effects on overtopping and the increase of the overtopping rate, given the fact that the railway line is really close to the seaside. When talking about coastal solutions, we as coastal engineers have a wide range of solutions which could be applied. These solutions range from very soft solutions like planting or beach nourishment to much more harder solutions as the typical revetments, groins, or even wave and flood walls. These solutions have a different environmental impact, ranging from do nothing and planting, which have very low environmental impact, and then hard solutions such as flood wall has a really big impact. So then there are a number of factors which make us decide about these solutions. So how do we select between these solutions? Well, the first thing of all would be just to try to assess the offshore wave climate. So with this, we assess the offshore wave conditions offshore, and then how frequent the wave conditions come from one direction or other, and also the kind of return period that is associated to each wave height. So then when we do that, for the offshore conditions, we have to transfer these conditions near shore, since we really need to know what's snowing in our near side area. So then we usually transfer these conditions by using a software, numerical wave propagation. In this case, we usually in Arup use MI21 spectral wave. For this case now, we didn't do a numerical model just because we had the previous information of this area, but this would be the normal procedure. Once that we have the wave conditions near shore, what we do is we assess geotechnical conditions, sediment transport conditions, which are the boundaries of our site, And of course, we take into consideration functional requirements, which is really why do we need coastal protection in this particular area. For the option assessments that we did for this study, first thing was we generated a short list of options for each of the areas, and then we define a number of criteria which we will be using to define a preferred solution. In this case, since we are trying to give a big importance to environmental conditions, we define the fact of a solution being environmentally friendly as very important. We also try to promote the concept of climate change because, as we see, it can be a challenge for coastal structures, so that will be another important factor. Then factors will be how specific to site is the solution, public safety, of course, and other, as you can see there on the screen, licensing and permits, and practicality in construction, and of course the impacts on adjoining areas. Then we gave a weight to each of these criteria, and then we qualified each of the criteria against the value. So I just mentioned the environmental considerations, and for this particular area we have to bear in mind that this area is really well protected with a number of different figures, like special protection area or natural heritage area, so that will be a key factor to take into consideration for the assessment of possible solutions. Planning, consent, and licensing is also a challenging issue in the sense that sometimes our solution can be quite constrained because of the licensing needed for get adoption. For example, any kind of solution which involves work in the foreshore will involve quite extensive public consultation and the need for a foreshore license. So that's a factor that we have to bear in mind. Needless to say about environmental considerations and the need of an EIS. Then applying this procedure to the 3 different areas that I just described before, here is a list with the short list options. I would like to mention that what we try to do is try to combine 2 different kinds of options. For example, we combine harder solutions, for example, groins or revetments, with softer solutions with beach nourishment, since we are really trying to enhance natural options. Just to focus on one of the areas, so you can follow the procedure, this will be the scoring for Greystone's North Beach. So then we gave a score ranging from 1 to 5. 5 will be that the criteria is totally met, and 1 that the criteria is not met. So we can see for all the criteria that we defined before, the scoring that we gave for each of the options, short list. So in this case we have 5 short list options, and here are the scores. Here are the scores after the weighting with the criteria. I would like to highlight that this weighting of the criteria was based on previous Arup's experience and tailored for this specific situation where we try to highlight the environmental aspects. But of course, this criteria can be modeled in relation to the project that we are working. In this case, we can see that the preferred solution, after following this criteria, was the partial revetment with beach nourishment. Then for the other areas, I'm summarizing here in this slide the different options which were selected. For Braehead area, the preferred solution consisted of upgrading the existing coastal assets. Just because there were a big number of them, they were meeting the functional criteria, so they were protecting the head, which is what was intended. And then this solution will be cost effective, and of course it will need a minimum of licensing and permits. For Greystone's North Beach, as we just saw before in the recent table, we were proposing a partial revetment with beach nourishment. The partial revetment will fix the whole line in a sense that it will slow its erosion rate and it will provide a natural aspect. So we're proposing a revetment only at the top of the cliffs. And also this will be complemented by beach nourishment. So it will be a natural solution with a nice visual impact, and it's also practical to construct. For Greystone South Beach, the preferred solution was a revetment with beach extension and nourishment. with this solution, what we will get is to have a big surface in front of the existing revetment, so that will lead to a more protected area. So then the railway line will be protected against overtopping, and also we will increase the recreational area. So it could benefit from this solution. Finally, I'm going to present briefly a conclusion and recommendations from both studies. Well, first of all, I would say that the key conclusion maybe from these both studies was the conclusion that we really need to take into consideration climate change in all the considerations and future design that the Irish Rail undertakes in the future. Just because climate change is happening, it's happening even nowadays, and it's likely to be worse in the future. So we really encourage Irish Rail to take this into consideration. Then, as we also mentioned, and Cathal mentioned that, and Emer, that it's really important to know the assets that Irish Rail has in place. In that sense, we were giving some recommendations to improve the existing database. Then, an holistic approach is needed always in coastal engineering, in the sense that we really need to design solutions which are good for a bigger extent of the area. So we always have to look at the whole picture as opposed to specific and isolated areas. This holistic approach also means that we have to take into consideration a wide range of options. There's no one-fit option for any area, so it's very good to have a good picture of a wide range of possible solutions, if possible, taking into consideration environmentally friendly aspects. Then both methodologies can be applied in any other areas and also for every kind of infrastructure. And finally, and that's from the point of view of coastal protection, we really would recommend, or would wish that there was a national strategy which would identify priority areas for developing coastal protection, in the sense that in Ireland right now there is no coastal protection strategy which prioritise areas in a way that, in a similar way as the UK has its coastal management plans. So it would be good if this a similar approach could be undertaken in Ireland. So some areas will be prioritized, and we will know which are the areas which are more useful to put the funds there. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll take any questions that you may have. Any questions? Sean?
Sean Mason from Arup. I suppose the obvious hard question for Cathal and Irish Rail is, you've obviously problems that are going to get worse. Hopefully this kind of work can help look for the obvious funding that you're going to need going forward.
Thanks, Sean. Straight to the hard question. The money. It's all about the money. You know, it is a good question, because you know, you do a lot of this research, and it is about developing tools and equipping ourselves to make better decisions, or to make more informed decisions. But ultimately, it's all with a view to getting investment into the assets, and it is an increasingly critical challenge for us. And even only recently, we've changed ourselves structurally within Éire Northern, and the way we're funded from the government, in terms of now we receive the subvention we get is under the auspices of a multi-annual contract, and that was set up, and that the mechanisms for that was set up a number of years ago, back in around 2010. That the baseline for the funding that we get was developed 2010, 2011. But what we have seen between 2011 and 2015 is the significant increase financially on us in terms of funding. And how we're addressing it, I mean, such was the extent of the flooding and the impacts and the coastal erosion over the Christmas period, that, like I said, but also like all the road authorities and other, that we saw the impacts in housing and everything like that. But we have been making specific representations to the Department of Transport specifically on that, and actually we're quite happy to only recently receive an element of specific funding, because they have acknowledged the criticality of the situation we faced. But key to us demonstrating to the paymasters, to the Department of Transport, is actually being able to demonstrate to them the impacts of the problems, and that is really done not through engineers telling civil servants and the like that, oh, we need more money, we need more money. It's about, here is a rational basis for the fact that we need money, not just that we've delayed trains or closed lines and that temporarily for flooding, but based on scientific data, based on things like decision tools, which this kind of research can really help with. And I think that's increasingly important when the funding that you're vying for, you're competing with all other state bodies and stakeholders in that.
Have you gone to Europe as well,
We have gone to we have our fingers in a couple of elements of 10T funding pots, but I mean, I think one of the critical conclusions that Susanna mentioned is for coastal specifically is a national strategy on that.
Yeah.
And I think if we have a national strategy, you're in a much stronger place nationally to go forward for whatever European funding might be available. And so I think that's one of the important conclusions from the research.
Just a question, or two brief questions. First is, has Iarn Road Éireann carried out a national study in terms of risk assessment of the rail line, and would it know how much would be coastal side rail and how much would be inland? And then just a second question in terms of your GIS database, would you use, or would you refer to other databases, or how compatible with the Iarn Road Éireann GIS database be with other agencies that maybe overlay?
Yeah. Okay. The first one, in terms of our knowledge of the coastal areas and the inland flooding areas or throughout the network, I think that was one of the points I was making around asset knowledge, and it's something that we've significantly invested huge efforts in over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of gathering and getting as much asset knowledge as we can. And the kind of things we've been doing with that is development of a range of decision support tools, and so taking flooding or coastal as an example, we have a risk evaluation tool for flooding that we use now and that we have in development on the basis of these recurring events. So it's about gathering a lot of the asset information and then developing the types of tools that can help you prioritise. And again, with funding ultimately being the final solution to a lot of these things, you need to be able to prioritise. There's always going to be more work to be done and more risk than money can afford that is available. And so the prioritisation is really important, and that is based on proper asset knowledge. So I think we do have the tools. We have very good knowledge now on the assets and on the flood areas and the coastal areas. Some of the things that we've been doing specifically, which leads to the GIS question you ask, is about 3 or 4 years ago we did, for example, a very extensive LiDAR survey over the full network, and we've been mapping that onto our GIS. We've also been mapping on things like as Susanna pointed out, the SACs, the Special Areas of Conservation, and the Special Protected Areas. So we've been taking those from other bodies and we've been mapping those onto our own GIS as well. So we're developing a number of interfaces with other suites of information that is available. I think there's some way to go there to have it all encompassing, and I think that's what Emer was alluding to as well in terms of development of the GIS. So a lot of work done there, but I think there improvements can still be developed there.
Excuse me if I stand up. I really prefer to stand up on occasions like this, because when we speak, it's possible to speak more easily. The thing is, I'm wondering if anyone is looking into the effect of on the runoff in the catchment of planting trees where there's pasture, because I've seen some work has been done on this in the context of flooding in general, and I'm wondering if this would be relevant. For example, it might be useful if there were trees planted on Bray Head.
Thanks for that. We didn't look at it in the context of this particular study, because that'd be more, I suppose, it would be worthwhile looking at it when you're looking at the solution side of the flooding problems. Specific to Bray Head, it's quite rocky, so I'm not an ecologist by any means, so I'm not sure if that would be of benefit. I think that would definitely be on the solution end, and it would certainly slow down the flow of water from the head of the catchment to the outfall at the rail corridor interface. Yep.
Just to expand on that, I think it's a very good point, and one of the things we've observed ourselves, more so in our embankment and earth structures throughout the network, and we've literally thousands of those, we do see the impacts of the different types of vegetation, and that's in situ in the embankments, and it's certainly a determinant factor in the performance of the earth structure itself. So it's certainly something that can impact.
To explore this further by email later on, I can address all of you.
Very good, yes.
I'm Alan from Trinity College. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I have to express an interest here at the outset in that I'm leading a European project at the moment, which is looking at risk assessment of infrastructure networks to extreme weather events with a focus on climate change, which is very relevant to what you're doing here. In our project, our focus is very much on quantitative risk assessment, where we're looking at the probabilities of events, and then we're looking at the consequences of events, and working with meteorologists and engineers then to assess probabilities of failure on networks of line, coupling that with consequence to come up with a risk index, which then we can use to prioritise maintenance actions and then look at mitigation measures. And I wonder, in the kind of qualitative methodology which you've presented here, first of all, have you calibrated that against some quantitative work? And secondly, in all of these processes where you're estimating risk, particularly where model uncertainty is inherent in the process, it's important to perform sensitivity analysis with issues such as the weighting, which you highlighted, to determine the robustness of the conclusions which you're drawing on the measures which you're proposing to take, allowing for effects which are 15, 20, 50 years into the future. So did you perform that kind of sensitivity analysis, or have you got the ability within the tool to perform that kind of sensitivity analysis?
Well, thank you. Yeah, the points that you are making are really valid, and as part of this study, we didn't calibrate this assessment. We just assigned a higher weight to the criteria that we felt that it was more important. But also, Arup, as part of our knowledge and research, we are also involved in different international groups dealing with this issue of climate change. And of course, the need of calibration is really appears everywhere. And also the fact that, for example, a storm event of 200 years, which happens in the last 3 years, 3 or 4 times, maybe it's not a 200 years event anymore. So there is a need of, first of all, defining the right scenario, which is part of all these research groups in climate change, and then, as you are saying, calibrating and verifying that with reality. But as part of this specific study, we just did based on our engineering experience, and then we gave a weight just because we wanted some environmentally friendly solutions. But I totally see your point, and I agree.
Just answer from the flooding perspective. Sorry. That's also reiterates Susanna's point. That's very relevant, an excellent point. We didn't calibrate this. A lot of the catchments we were looking at are very small agricultural catchments from the external rail corridor, external to the rail corridor. Similar to Susanna's study, the purpose was just to prioritise. So someone looking at one particular section of the rail corridor could just focus their attention where they need to look first, particularly if it's a known area of risk. If we're looking at a larger water course, it'll be much easier to calibrate. They'll be more likely to have flow meters or gauge data. Whereas when these are little ditches or streams, it's quite hard to calibrate that data. One way we could look at it is looking at different methods of estimating the flow. But when it comes to, that would be the external catchments, when it comes to the rainfall impact on the rail corridor itself, it's more looking at relative to the 1 in 10 year rainfall versus the 1 in 100 versus location A compared to location B. So, and where how that interacts with the external rail corridor, the catchment's external rail corridor. Thanks.
I'm Catherine Joyce from Irish Rail. I was wondering, was there a key piece of information that you felt we didn't have in our records? Was there any omissions that you thought we should focus on in our data?
What I would like to say is that on the other hand, we were really surprised, and it was a nice surprise to see that everything was really monitored, in the sense that it was really well recorded. The time I'm talking about the coastal issues, like for example, it was really frequently monitored and recorded, so all the assets there was plenty of information. What we may feel that it may be missing is a better process of that information, so maybe an external user can go and in a quick way try to find or some statistical assessment, because there was plenty of information, too much to assess in fact. So it would be really, from a point of view at least, the post-processing of the information, because otherwise it was brilliant and really well monitored, and constant evolution monitoring.
Just one point on that. Sorry, one point on that was I agree with Susanna. The information available was amazing amounts of information, and culvert inspections were very regular, and there were plenty of them. The only thing that I would noted that would be a big asset and quite an easy to add on bit of information would be to survey the water course around the culverts, because I understand from Irish Rail's perspective the key criteria is that the structural capacity of the culvert and the structural integrity. Whereas for someone assessing the hydraulic performance, we needed a bit more information on the actual water course. Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much.
There was numerous references to the ballast being choked with fines. I couldn't quite see the importance of this. Is this true because the drainage facilities of the ballast was disapproved, or was it for the stability of the line? It didn't seem to me to be relevant to the stability of the line.
That the ingress of fines, it's generally, well, it prevents it being free. If you need the rail to drain away, you generally would need a free flow through the ballast. If it becomes completely clogged, you're going to see more flooding on the surface of the rail. So, and Colin, so you can.
Yeah. I mean, ballast should be free draining. That's one of the functions of it, and when it gets clogged with fines, it tends to, as Ian was talking about, ponding and things like that tend to happen more regularly, and it's a major effort for us continually to ensure the ballast is of a good quality and free draining.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, one more.
Sorry, I'm actually part of the Railway Committee, and I'd just like to thank you for a brilliant presentation. I realised that someone was supposed to introduce you, and it never happened. But I'd like to thank Cathal, Emer and Susanna for coming and presenting for us on this, and hopefully we'll have another presentation around April or May, and we'll let you know about it. There's a sign-in sheet going around, so I think it's over halfway through, so if you want to sign it before you leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you.